Hey guys, tonight we begin with what medieval knights actually did between battles, which turns out to be significantly less glorious and significantly more administrative than anyone ever put in a romance poem. Then we spend some time with William Marshal, the man who went from near starvation to the most celebrated knight in Europe, mostly by being extremely difficult to kill and extraordinarily good at paying attention. After that, you become a tournament fighter in the 12th century, which is less a sport and more organised kidnapping with horses and a formal ransom structure that everyone pretended was about something else. And finally, we look at the chivalric code itself, the gap between the ideal that got written down and the reality that got quietly negotiated around by everyone who was supposed to be following it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I always like seeing where in the world people are watching from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up because someone is shouting outside your door, and this is normal. Everything here begins with someone shouting. You lie still for a moment, staring at the ceiling of the chamber you have been given, which is not your chamber and has never been your chamber, and you become aware with the slow, creeping certainty of a body that has had time to compile a full report during the night of several physical facts about your situation. Your shoulders ache in the way that suggests they have a specific complaint and they intend to file it formally. Your hands are stiff, the joints sitting somewhere between merely inconvenient and genuinely limiting until they warm up and decide to be functional again. The knee, the one that took a blow at the last tournament 2 months ago and has been reconsidering its purpose ever since, communicates its position on the morning with a clarity that borders on eloquence. You are a knight, technically. Technically is doing a great deal of work in that sentence. The room is cold. Not bitterly cold, not the kind of cold that demands immediate action, but the slow, ambient cold of a stone building in the early morning of what might charitably be described as late autumn, when the fires have died down overnight and the walls have had several hours to absorb the chill and are now radiating it back at you with quiet enthusiasm. The blanket, which is thick and wool and smells faintly of horse and old smoke, has migrated during the night into a shape that covers roughly half of you, which is better than some mornings and worse than others. You pull it back up around your shoulders for one more moment. This is not rest. This is delay. There is a difference, and you're becoming an expert in it. The shout outside resolves itself into the voice of the stable boy, who is not shouting at you but is shouting at another stable boy about something that apparently requires immediate and loud resolution before sunrise, regardless of who else might be sleeping. You close your eyes again. It does not help. Your brain has already begun its inventory of the day ahead, cataloguing obligations with the efficiency of a clerk who's been waiting for you to wake up and who has a great deal of material to get through. There is the training session this morning with the Master at Arms. There is the afternoon attendance on your lord, which involves being present and available and useful in ways that will become clear only when they are required of you, and not before. There is the letter from your brother sitting in the satchel by the bed, the one about the property dispute on the eastern boundary of your father's estate, the one you have been meaning to answer for 2 weeks and have not answered. There is the fact that your boots need new stitching, and you have been putting off taking them to the cobbler, because taking them to the cobbler requires both boots to be absent simultaneously, which feels like an unnecessary vulnerability. Welcome to the between time, not war, not the tournament circuit, not the clean, narrative-friendly moments that the poets take an interest in. This is the other part of knighthood, the part that comprises most of it, the long, administrative, politically complicated, physically unglamorous majority of a life that was sold to you, in your childhood, as something considerably more cinematic. You sit up slowly, and your body offers a comprehensive review of the previous week. The shoulders are from the training session 3 days ago, when your lord's Master at Arms decided that you and the younger squires needed to spend 2 hours working on mounted lance technique in a field that turned out to be significantly muddier than anyone had anticipated, and which required approximately 45 additional minutes of work at the end, just getting the horses clean enough that the groom stopped looking at you with that specific expression. The knee is older than that. The general sense of tiredness that settles over everything like a fine grey mist is simply the condition of your existence, the chronic background state of a person who does not sleep enough, does not eat enough of the right things, trains consistently in a way that produces fitness at a cost that your body submits the invoice for every morning. You swing your legs over the edge of the bed and set your feet on the floor, which is stone and cold, in the way that stone floors in the early morning are always cold, which is to say aggressively, with personal commitment to the project of making you reconsider your decision to stand up. You locate your boots. One of them is exactly where you left it, which is a minor victory. The other has apparently migrated overnight and requires a brief search before it turns up under the edge of the bed, in the company of a candle stub, a small piece of wax and the letter from your brother, which has also been living under the bed in a state of studied innocence while you continued to not answer it. The letter, like most letters from your elder brother, contains a mixture of family news, quiet pressure, and one or two pieces of information that require you to do something about something. The property dispute involves a boundary marker that your neighbour claims has moved. Your brother's position is that it has not moved. Your neighbour's position is that it has. Determining who is correct requires either a formal legal proceeding, which is expensive and slow, and will certainly produce a decision that satisfies neither party, or a visit from someone with enough standing to mediate informally, which is you, because your brother manages the land but you are the one with the sword and the title, and the social position that makes informal mediation something other than one man shouting at another man about stones. You have been putting this visit off for 3 months on the grounds that the campaign season might require your presence elsewhere, but the campaign season has ended and the dispute has not, and your brother's letters are becoming less newsy and more pointed with each iteration. You fold the letter, put it back in the satchel and begin to dress. This is not a quick process. The padded gambeson goes on first, which is thick and hot and designed to be worn under armour, which means it is entirely unsuited to wearing around a castle in a non-combat context, and yet you wear it anyway, partly because it is what you have and partly because there is always, in the background of any day you spend in a lord's household in a period of political instability, a non-negligible chance that today is the day something requires armour in a hurry. Being caught without your gambeson on a day like that is the kind of thing that earns you a reputation, and reputations are hard to displace once established. After the gambeson, you're outer clothes, which are serviceable rather than fine. You are a knight, but you're not a wealthy knight. The distinction is visible in your wardrobe and in your horse, and in the quality of the accommodation you have been given, which is a private chamber, because that much has been earned. But a private chamber at the far end of a corridor that is cold in winter and loud in summer, and has a persistent damp smell near the east wall that no one has investigated or explained. By the time you're dressed and have made some attempt to organise your hair into a shape that suggests intentionality, the castle is fully awake around you. You can hear it in layers, feet on stone floors in the corridor, the sound of the kitchens beginning their work 1 floor below, the distant rhythmic clanging that means someone is already in the smithy doing something metal and important, the low murmur of voices from the great hall where people are gathering for the morning meal. You pick up the satchel, consider the letter for a moment, decide not to think about it again until after breakfast, and go. The great hall in the morning is loud in the way that places are loud, when a large number of people are doing ordinary things in proximity to each other. Not the noise of crisis or celebration, but the sustained ambient sound of communal life. Conversations overlapping, benches scraping against the floor, the particular clatter of breakfast being set out along the long trestle tables that run the length of the space. You find your usual spot between Eudes, who is large and cheerful, and has been with the Lord's household for 11 years, and whose opinion of the morning is always positive in a way you find slightly unreasonable, and Bertrand, who arrived 6 months ago from a minor lordship to the south, and is still working out the rules of where to sit and when to speak, and how to read the social geography of a household that has its own established customs, and that does not explain those customs to newcomers. The seating hierarchy in the Great Hall is one of those things that everyone understands and no one articulates directly. Higher-ranked household knights closer to the Lord's table, lower-ranked men and senior servants in the middle section, everyone else finding their place by instinct and precedent, and the quiet social calibration that happens in any group of people who spend significant amounts of time together in a defined space. Getting it wrong, sitting too high or in someone's established spot is not a catastrophic error, but it is noticed, and noticing accumulates, and accumulated noticing shapes reputation in ways that take longer to undo than they do to create. Breakfast is bread and ale and whatever was prepared the previous evening and survived the night. The bread this morning is dense and slightly flat, which means the cook was working with flour that was not entirely fresh, which means the grain stores are running lower than ideal, which means the steward is going to have a conversation with the Lord about the provisioning situation sometime in the next several days that everyone else in the household will pretend not to be paying close attention to while absolutely paying close attention to it. The ale is flat. The remnants from the previous evening's meal, a cold pottage of beans and salt pork that has been sitting in a pot since last night and has achieved the particular consistency of something that has given up and is simply waiting to be eaten, are present in a bowl that is placed in front of you without ceremony or comment. You eat it. You have eaten considerably worse than this for considerably longer periods, and your body has stopped having strong opinions about food that is edible. Strong opinions about food are a luxury, like adequate sleep, and a letter from your brother that you have already answered and do not have to think about anymore. Yudes talks about his horse while you eat, because Yudes talks about his horses the way other men talk about their children, which is to say at length and with detailed attention to physical and temperamental development that most of the conversation partners find either charming or exhausting depending on how much they like horses. You find it charming mostly because Yudes is genuinely expert and occasionally says something about horses that turns out to be useful. This morning he's talking about the animal's left foreleg, which has been intermittently stiff since a training session last week, and about whether this represents an injury that needs professional attention or a soreness that will resolve on its own, and about the specific indicators he is watching to determine which of those it is. You eat your cold pottage and listen, and ask questions when questions seem useful, because Yudes responds well to questions and because you have learned over the years that the kind of knowledge he carries around in his head about horses is the sort that is genuinely hard to find, and that cannot be acquired from books because nobody has written it down. It lives in people like him, accumulated through decades of observation and practice, and the only way to get access to it is to listen when he is talking. The morning after breakfast is where things become genuinely difficult to describe to anyone who has never done this. There is a period, roughly 2 hours in length on a quiet day, and potentially much longer on a complicated one, that you could call administrative, though that word does not quite capture the specific quality of the experience. You attend on your Lord. This means you are present in or near the rooms where he conducts his daily business, available when needed, occupied with tasks when not needed, and visible in a way that demonstrates your continued engagement with the household's affairs without being intrusive. The art of attending is something that takes years to develop properly, and the people who have developed it poorly fall into one of two failure modes: the ones who hover too close and become an irritant, and the ones who drift too far and stop being present when presence is required. You have been doing this long enough to have found the middle distance. Today's tasks include carrying a message to the steward about a dispute between two of the Lord's tenants regarding a shared boundary marker, which is a different boundary dispute from your brother's boundary dispute, but which shares the fundamental structure of all boundary disputes, which is that two people have different understandings of where a line is, and both of them feel the difference very personally. You find the steward in the storeroom off the north courtyard, where he is conducting an inventory of the grain supplies with the focused expression of a man who has already suspected the news is not good and is now receiving confirmation. You deliver the message, receive a reply, and depart with the reply, which you deliver to the person who asked you to deliver it, which completes a circuit of minor bureaucratic consequence that will not appear in any chronicle or poem or subsequent discussion of the period, but which is nonetheless real and necessary and part of how a lord's household functions. There is also the matter of the two younger squires who are currently under your informal supervision, not because this was formally assigned to you, but because the household structure created a gap, and you were standing in the gap at the right moment, and the expectation has gradually solidified around you like mortar. The younger one is 15 and has been here for 3 months and is making the specific errors of a person who was taught the theory of something before he encountered the practice of it, which means he knows what he is supposed to do and is consistently surprised that knowing what to do and doing it are different operations that require different kinds of preparation. The older one is 17 and has been here for 1.5 years and is past the theory-practice gap, but has developed a confidence in his own judgment that slightly outpaces the actual quality of that judgment, which is a phase that nearly everyone goes through and which resolves itself either through experience or through a specific incident that makes the correction unavoidable. You are watching for the incident. You find both of them in the stable yard, where they are supposed to be finishing the morning care of their assigned horses and are instead having a conversation about something entirely unrelated to horses, which is visible from 20 feet away. You do not shout at them. You walk to them at a normal pace and ask in a normal voice where they are in the morning's work, and the question itself communicates everything that needs to be communicated without the need for additional commentary. They go back to work. You watch for several minutes to ensure the resumption is genuine rather than performative, and then you continue with your own day. The waiting outside doors, as a category of professional experience, requires more examination than it typically receives, partly because it is so consistent a feature of the between time, and partly because what happens during it is more complex than the description suggests. You're not simply standing. You're present in a particular way that requires sustained attention to a diffuse set of signals, voices through doors, footsteps approaching or receding, the body language of people passing through the corridor who may or may not have information about the timing of your release from the obligation. You're reading a situation in real time from partial information, which is a skill you apply in every other context and which this context trains in its own specific way. Standing outside a door for an hour, paying attention to everything you can observe without moving, is not so different from reading a tournament field from the edge of the engagement before committing to a target. The mental habits are the same, the stakes are different. There is also the question of what you think about during the waiting. This is partly personal and partly professional, the distinction being not always clear. You think about the campaign that is being discussed behind the door, from the fragments you have assembled over the past several days from various overheard conversations and from Yudes, who's reliably well connected, and who provides intelligence without ever quite acknowledging that this is what he is doing. The campaign, if it happens, will take you away from the household for 4 to 6 months, which is normal and expected and has happened before, but which also has specific implications for the property dispute, for the letter, for the question of your knee, and whether the knee is something to deal with before the campaign or something to manage during it. None of these questions have clear answers, and the standing outside the door gives you time to not answer them with sustained attention. You also think, in the way that the between time permits when the immediate demands are low, about the younger of the two squires. He's 15, as mentioned, and he is making the specific errors of a person who is well prepared for the theory and is discovering the practice. But there is something in him, visible at moments in the training yard and at the Lord's table, and in the way he listens when something complicated is being explained, that suggests the practice will reshape rather than discourage him, which is the distinction that separates the people who develop from the people who do not. You were 15 once and making different but structurally similar errors, and someone in the household you were placed in watched you with the same quality of attention you're now directing toward this boy, and made the same quiet assessment, and was right that the errors were developmental rather than permanent. You know this because you are here. The afternoon before the training session also contains a visit to the armourer, who has the haube géant and has examined the 2 rings you flagged. His assessment confirms yours. They need replacement rather than repair, which is a distinction that matters for durability, and the replacement will take 2 days, which means you will train tomorrow in less than your full kit, which is uncomfortable but not unusual. The armourer is a man of 50 with hands that have been working metal since he was 12 and that show it in every dimension, and he talks about the rings with the specific authority of someone who has been looking at this problem for 30 years and who has developed opinions about it that go considerably beyond what any training in his craft could have provided. You listen. You have learned to listen to people who know things you do not know, and to treat their expertise with the respect that its development required, which is a posture that many people of your rank do not consistently manage, and that has consistently served you. The evening meal, the evening at the Lord's table that was described earlier, also contains a moment that was not described, because it happened at the far end of the meal when several of the company had already excused themselves and the conversation had moved from the formal register to the more relaxed exchange that the later part of an evening permits. Your lord asked you directly what you thought about the road conditions on the northern approach to the region where the campaign would operate. It was a genuine question, not a test, and you answered it genuinely, drawing on what you had seen 4 years ago and on what Yudes had told you about the changes since. He listened without interrupting, which meant either that your answer was useful or that he was too polite to indicate that it was not. and afterward he asked a follow-up question that suggested the former. This is a small thing. It is also the kind of thing that shapes how you are regarded, not in dramatic ways, but in the cumulative way that small things shape regard when they are repeated over months and years. You are someone whose assessment is worth asking for. You did not have this when you arrived, or not in this household, and acquiring it has been a matter of consistent behaviour over the time you've been here, and it is not something that can be hurried. The training session in the afternoon is the part of the day you do not dread. The yard is familiar in a way that nothing else here is familiar. You know the ground, you know the equipment, you know most of the people, and the work itself follows rules that are clear and physical and immediate in a way that the administrative morning is not. You spend the first hour with the Master-at-Arms working through mounted exercises that focus on position and balance at speed. The kind of work that sounds simple when described and is not simple when done, because staying properly positioned on a horse that is moving fast over uneven ground, while also managing a weapon and tracking multiple points of threat, simultaneously requires a coordination that is never entirely automatic no matter how many times you have done it. Your body does most of it without consultation. The parts it does not do without consultation are the parts you are here to fix. The second hour is swords, working in pairs with blunted practice weapons and running through the combinations that your muscles know by now without needing to ask your brain for instructions. The repetition is the point, not because the combinations themselves are complex, but because in actual combat there is no time to choose what to do next. By the time you are choosing, the opportunity for that choice has already passed. The work in the training yard is about encoding the responses so deeply that the encoding itself becomes faster than the situation that requires it. You do not decide to bring your sword up on the left diagonal, you simply find it already there, your body having processed the incoming threat and responded before the processing reached your conscious attention. Yudes is your partner for the sword work, which is the best and worst possible arrangement. Best because he is reliable and experienced and has the specific quality of a training partner who makes you better rather than simply making you tired. Worst because he knows your tendencies better than you do yourself at this point, and exploits them with the patient efficiency of someone who has had years to catalogue them and is in no hurry to let you forget what they are. He catches your right side drop twice in 30 minutes. The same vulnerability he has been pointing out to you with decreasing subtlety for the past 2 months. And the third time he does it, he does not say anything at all, which is somehow worse than if he had. The Master-at-Arms switches your partner to Bertrand halfway through the session, which is a tactical choice designed to do 2 things at once. Give you the experience of adjusting quickly to a different fighter's patterns, and give Bertrand the experience of working with someone significantly more experienced. The difference is immediately apparent. Bertrand is fast, faster than you expected him to be from watching him in earlier sessions, and he has a particular combination that begins with a feint on the left that is genuinely good, executed with enough commitment that the first time he tries it, you find yourself responding to the feint rather than the actual strike. The second time, you are ready. The third time, you change your approach entirely to make the feint less useful, which forces him to adjust, which is the actual point of the exercise, not the defeat or the victory within any single exchange, but the process of mutual adaptation that makes both of you more capable. Your arms are burning by the time the session concludes. The knee has upgraded its earlier communication to something more pointed and specific, the kind of message that you cannot entirely ignore, but that you are experienced enough to accurately classify as something to be managed rather than something that requires immediate intervention. You walk back through the yard with the particular gait of someone who is distributing their weight carefully without making this distribution obvious, which is a gait you have had years of practice developing and which fools approximately nobody who knows you and has been watching you for any length of time. The afternoon after training is for whatever needs doing, which today includes a conversation with the castle's chaplain about a request you made 3 weeks ago for a document you need for the property dispute. A conversation that resolves itself into the discovery that the document has been prepared and was waiting in the chaplain's possession for 2 weeks while he waited for a good moment to mention it, which is the kind of bureaucratic minor comedy that you're too tired to find funny, but that you note with the weary recognition of someone who has navigated enough institutional processes to understand that these are the textures of which they are made. You take the document, add it to the satchel with the unanswered letter, and continue. There is also the equipment review, which you try to do at least once a week, and which you have been delaying this week because doing it properly takes time and attention, and there has been no clear block of time and attention available. Your Haubergen, the chainmail that is the most expensive single piece of equipment you own, and the most critical to your continued existence in the profession, requires regular inspection for broken links and weak points in the rings. You spread it out on the bed in your chamber and work through it systematically, section by section, the way you were taught, running your fingers along the metal to feel for inconsistencies that the eye might miss. You find 2 links that have stretched slightly beyond what is comfortable and mark them for the smith. Not urgent, but not something to ignore. Equipment that needs attention and does not receive it has a reliable tendency to require attention at exactly the wrong moment. The evening begins. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch. The evening begins with the transformation of the Great Hall into something that requires a different kind of behaviour from everyone inside it. The trestle tables are rearranged, the better candles are lit along the walls, and the social performance that constitutes life in a lord's household shifts into a higher register in ways that are partly ceremonial and partly genuinely important. You're eating at your lord's table tonight, which is an honour in the specific medieval sense of the word, a marker of status and trust and continued inclusion in the inner circle of the household's social hierarchy, and also an obligation, because eating at the lord's table means being present and engaged and contributing to the conversation in ways that are appropriate to the setting and that reflect well on you, and therefore on your lord for including you. You wash your face and hands with more care than usual, change your outer clothes to the better set, and make a second attempt at your hair that produces results only marginally more convincing than the first attempt, but that is, at least, clearly an attempt. You go down to the hall. The food is better than this morning's cold pottage by enough of a margin that the comparison seems slightly unfair. There is roasted meat, which is good, and bread that was baked this afternoon, which is still warm in the way that freshly baked bread is warm, which is one of the more reliable small pleasures of a life that is not reliably full of small pleasures. There is a source that suggests the kitchen is functioning at something above minimum capacity. There is wine, thin but present, and the presence of wine rather than ale signals the social register of the meal as clearly as the better candles signal it in the visual register. The conversation at the Lord's table follows its own geography, moving through topics that are safe and carefully around topics that are not safe, with a practiced elegance that most people at the table perform without thinking about the performance. There is discussion of the possible expedition that has been under consideration for several weeks now, framed carefully enough that no commitment is implied but interest is clearly established, and the shape of the planning that would be required begins to take form in the conversation without anyone explicitly naming it as planning. There is a brief, politely managed disagreement about a neighbouring lord's recent decision regarding road tolls, which is on its surface about road tolls and is not actually about road tolls at all, being instead about an older disagreement involving a marriage arrangement that did not proceed as expected and that left a residue of complicated feeling that surfaces reliably whenever the two parties are required to discuss anything involving shared interests. You navigate this conversation with the attention it requires. You contribute when contributions are expected, agree where agreement is the appropriate response, ask questions when a question will move the conversation forward in a useful direction, and are quiet when quiet is the contribution the moment calls for. This is a skill. It does not appear on any list of knightly virtues. It is not discussed in the literature of chivalry with anything like the attention given to prowess and loyalty and generosity. And yet it is as real and as practiced and as necessary as the sword work in the training yard, because a man who cannot manage the social reality of a lord's table is a man who will not remain at that table long, and a man who does not remain at the table has lost the access to the networks of patronage and information and influence that keep a knightly career alive. Later, well after the formal meal has wound down and most of the company has dispersed to their various sleeping arrangements, you sit with youths near what remains of the fire. The hall at this hour is quieter, almost peaceful. The candles burned low enough that the light is warm and soft and forgiving, in the way that insufficient light is always forgiving. There are 2 other men still awake at the far end of the table, both of them engaged in a conversation too quiet to hear from where you're sitting, and the sound of their voices forms a background texture that makes the quiet feel inhabited rather than empty. Yudes talks about his son, who is 8 years old and was sent as a page to a household to the north 6 months ago. He talks about the morning the boy left, and about the expression on the boy's face when he understood that leaving was permanent for now, that the household where he would grow up was not going to be his father's household, but somewhere further away and belonging to someone else. He talks about how the boy did not cry until after the horses were brought out, and about how he, Yudes, did not cry at all, and about how he is not certain what to make of this. You listen. You do not offer reassurance, because reassurance would be beside the point, and you do not offer advice, because it was not solicited, and you do not minimize what he is describing because it is not small. You simply listen, which is what the moment asks for, and after a while Yudes stops talking about his son and shifts to talking about the expedition again, and you shift with him. The conversation about the expedition is different in register from the conversation at the Lord's table. Here, between two men who know each other well enough to be direct, it is grounded in the specific practical concerns of people who have done this before, not the political rationale and not the formal objectives, but the actual experience, the supply question, the condition of the roads, the likely duration, the wear on horses and men, the specific variables that determine whether a campaign is survivable in the way that preserves your capability to continue afterward, or survivable in the way that leaves you technically alive but operationally finished for months. Yudes knows things about the provisioning situation from his contacts in the steward's office. You know things about the terrain from a campaign you conducted in the same region 4 years ago. Between you, the picture that emerges is more complete and more honest than anything that will appear in any official document about the expedition, which will naturally emphasize the strategic rationale and the expected outcome, and not the mud and the grain estimates and the horses. You do not talk about the property dispute. You do not talk about your knee. You do not talk about the fact that you are 31 years old and have been doing this specific kind of life for a long time, and that the question of what comes next is one that surfaces in the quiet moments with increasing frequency, and that you do not have a clear answer to and are not entirely sure you want one yet. These are the things you carry with you into the between time, the background accumulation of the unresolved, which is not so different from what everyone carries, the letter in the satchel, the knee that may or may not be more serious than it appears, the question of whether the life you have been building towards something has arrived yet at that something, or whether it is still in the process of arriving, or whether the building was always the point and there is no separate arrival waiting somewhere ahead. The fire dies down. Yudes excuses himself. You stay a little longer in the cooling hall, watching the coals lose their light in stages, listening to the castle settle into its nighttime sounds. The distant call of the watch from the tower, the creak of the building that old stone buildings make when the temperature drops, the wind moving around the walls with a comfortable persistence of something that was here before the walls were built and will be here after they're gone. This is the between time, the long, administrative, unglamorous, politically complex, physically demanding, socially precise, between time that comprises most of a nightly life and appears in almost none of the songs, and somewhere in the quiet middle of it, sitting next to a dying fire in a stone hall that is getting colder by degrees, you reach a conclusion that took years to find its way to the surface, and that is still surprising even now that it has arrived. This is not the waiting for the real thing. This is the real thing. The tournament, the battle, the moment of action and clear consequence, those are the interruptions. This, the cold morning and the training yard and the standing outside doors and the unanswered letter and the dying fire and the conversation between two men who are honest with each other about the things that matter, this is the actual shape of the life, and somehow, incredibly, that is almost all right. That said, the story of what happens in the between time has its counterpart in a different kind of story, one that begins not in a comfortable stone chamber but in a field, in a crisis, with a child who does not yet understand what is being decided about him. Because for all the administrative reality of daily nightly life, the lives that defined the era, that gave it its enduring shape, were not administrative at all. They were the lives of people who started with nothing and built something out of the specific materials their world offered them, which were often dangerous and insufficient and exactly what was required. William Marshal was born somewhere around the year 1146, fourth son of John Marshal, a minor royal official who held his position and his land through the combination of dogged loyalty and practical opportunism that characterized the more successful participants in the civil war known as the Anarchy. The anarchy, which ran from the late 1130s through the early 1150s, was a prolonged conflict between King Stephen and the Empress Matilda over the English throne, a conflict without a decisive resolution that dragged through years of burning and raiding and political reversal until both sides arrived at an exhausted compromise. John Marshal was not a particularly admirable figure by most measures, but he was effective. He assessed situations accurately, committed when commitment was advantageous, and switched sides when the calculation required it, which in the context of the anarchy it regularly did. He survived. William's earliest encounter with the world's indifference to his survival came before he was old enough to have formed settled memories of it. During the siege of Newbury Castle, John Marshal gave his son as a hostage to King Stephen, guaranteeing that he would surrender the castle peacefully. Then he sent word to the Empress Matilda for reinforcements and refused to surrender. Stephen, who was not stupid, understood what had happened. He had the child brought to him and threatened to kill him if John did not comply. John, demonstrating the specific quality that made him effective and also extremely difficult to like, reportedly sent word that he did not care because he had the anvil and the hammer to make more and better sons. Whether this was calculated bluff or genuine indifference to his fourth son's fate is not something the sources permit us to determine with confidence. What they do record is Stephen's response, which was to look at the child and decide he could not do it. The story was told later with various embellishments, but the core seems reliably attested. Stephen held the young William and found him charming in the specific way that very young children are charming, which is to say completely without calculation, offering no reason for either mercy or harm beyond the simple fact of being present and alive. He did not kill him. He kept him for some time, apparently treating him with reasonable kindness, until the political situation resolved itself in the way that political situations in the anarchy resolved themselves, which is to say partially, temporarily, and leaving several problems in place for later. William, set free, returned to his family's orbit without anyone apparently noting that this was a significant event. He was a fourth son. The inheritance was going elsewhere. He had been returned, which was the outcome of the hostage arrangement, and now the problem of himself remained to be solved. This was normal. This was expected. What was less expected was what he did with it. He entered the educational system that the medieval aristocracy had developed for boys of his situation. Service in a noble household, moving through the stages from page to squire to knight, in a process that combined physical training with social education in approximately equal measure. As a page you ran errands, watched, listened, and began to develop the physical coordination that the later training would build on. You held horses, you served at table, you absorbed through continuous exposure the specific codes of behaviour that governed how people of your class moved through the world, how you stood, how you spoke, how you acknowledged precedents, how you behaved in the company of people more powerful than yourself without either disappearing entirely or overreaching. As a squire, you trained more seriously and more deliberately, working through the physical grammar of a world built around mounted combat, with the focused attention that the stakes required. You learned to ride, which most boys of your background could already do to some degree, and then you learned to ride in the specific ways that combat required, which were different from riding for travel or pleasure in every dimension that mattered. You learned to fight on foot and on horseback, with lance and sword and shield, in the controlled conditions of the training yard, and eventually in the less controlled conditions that approximated actual engagement. He went to Normandy to complete this formation, placed in the household of his mother's cousin William de Tankerville, who was the Chamberlain of Normandy, one of the more significant administrative positions in the Anglo-Norman world. De Tankerville had the resources to provide proper training, and the connections to provide the context in which that training could be converted into a career. He introduced the young William to the networks that mattered, created opportunities that would not have existed otherwise, and seems to have been a genuinely useful patron rather than simply a comfortable placement. The tournament circuit was where those opportunities first became real. Tournaments in the middle of the 12th century were not the organised spectacles of the later medieval period, with their formal structures and their careful safety provisions, and their transformation into something that looked more like theatre than combat. They were large, dangerous, and conducted across open countryside with no fixed arena and no clear ending condition. Teams of knights gathered, fought across whatever terrain was available, and the object was to unhorse and capture opponents, taking their horses, armour, and whatever ransom could be negotiated. The better fighters accumulated wealth. The worse fighters, or the unlucky ones, lost the equipment that was both their professional capital and their means of staying in the profession. The financial stakes were not symbolic. William's first tournament was unsuccessful in the way that first tournaments almost always were. He fought well enough to survive, which was not nothing, but he did not capture anyone and he lost his horse, which was financially and professionally disastrous in a way that is easy to say and harder to fully convey. Losing your horse at a tournament meant losing the primary instrument of your professional life, the asset whose value represented months or years of accumulated savings, the vehicle through which all future income would be generated. It meant either finding someone to lend you a replacement while you got back on your feet, which required being the kind of person who had that kind of credit, or stepping back from the circuit until the situation could be repaired, which meant losing momentum and reputation at precisely the moment when you had neither to spare. He did not collapse from this. He recovered, regrouped, and returned to the circuit with a different approach. What he developed over the following months and years was not a style of fighting built on physical dominance, though he was large and strong and had real physical advantages. It was a style built on intelligence, on reading the field rather than simply reacting to the immediate opponent, on identifying which targets offered the best combination of value and manageability, on working within a team structure to create advantages that individual effort could not generate, and on the specific patience that allows a fighter to wait for the right moment rather than committing to the moment that appears right because the commitment is available. This kind of fighting is not dramatic. It does not produce the spectacular single combat moments that the songs celebrate. It produces consistent winning, which is considerably more useful. The ransoms accumulated. Better horses were acquired. Better horses produced better results. The reputation built. By the early 1170s, William Marshal's name was one that other fighters recognised, and the recognition was of the specific kind that combines respect with caution, which is the most useful recognition in a profession where reputation directly affects how opponents assess you before the engagement begins. His position in the household of the young King Henry, which he entered sometime around the year 1170, was the event that transformed a successful tournament career into something larger. The young King Henry, eldest son of Henry II, was one of the more consequential frustrated personalities of the medieval period. He had been crowned co-king of England during his father's lifetime, in a ceremonial acknowledgement of his status as heir, and then denied any real power or authority for years, which produced the entirely predictable result of a young man of energy, pride, and considerable personal charm who had nothing to apply those qualities to except the tournament circuit and the planning of rebellions. William became the young king's tournament champion and closest companion. They travelled the circuit together through the 1170s, and the combination was formidable. The prince brought social prominence and access to the highest levels of the aristocratic world, while William brought the technical excellence that turned every tournament appearance into a demonstration rather than a risk. The financial returns were significant. The social returns were larger. Being known as the champion of the heir to the English throne placed William in a network of relationships and obligations that no amount of tournament success alone could have purchased. The relationship was not purely professional. What the sources record of the later years, particularly the period surrounding the young king's death, suggests something more complicated and more genuine. William was loyal to the young king in ways that were sometimes personally costly, defending him in situations where discretion might have recommended distance, staying with him through the rebellion against Henry II that ended in failure and embarrassment, and being present at the end with the patience and constancy that genuine loyalty requires, rather than the calculated proximity that professional loyalty prefers. The young king's first rebellion against his father, in 1173 and 1174, was a disaster that managed to involve virtually all of Henry II's sons, and a substantial portion of the baronage of England and France, and that ended with all of them losing, and Henry demonstrating once again that when he chose to apply his administrative and military capacity to a problem, the problem generally resolved in his favour and against everyone else's. William survived the aftermath of this rebellion in a way that required careful management. He had served the young king, who had been in rebellion, and he emerged from the situation without the stain of treachery that many others acquired. partly because his loyalty had been to his lord rather than to a political cause, and the distinction was recognised and respected even by those who'd been on the opposite side. There was also the matter of a specific accusation that was made against William during this period, and that he carried with him for the rest of his life even after it was formally resolved. The accusation was of an inappropriately close relationship with the young king's wife, Margaret of France, and it came from rivals within the household who understood that in the culture of the tournament world and the courtly tradition, the connection between a knight and a great lady was both idealised and exploitable. Whether there was any truth to the accusation is impossible to determine with certainty from the surviving evidence, which consists largely of William's later protestations of innocence and the fact that the young king eventually came to believe him. What the accusation did was temporarily break the relationship between William and his lord, sending him away from the household at a point in his career when the household was his primary source of income and influence. He survived this separation too. He went back to the tournament circuit as a working fighter rather than a household champion, which was a step down in status but a viable professional option, and he continued to build his reputation in the only way that reputation in this world was built, which was by demonstrating, repeatedly and in circumstances where the demonstration could not be disputed, that he was the best at what he did. The accusation was eventually addressed. He was reconciled with the young king. He returned to the household. Then the young king died, in the summer of 1183, of a fever contracted during the latest round of rebellion against his father, this one in the Limousin. He was 28 years old. He had never governed anything. He had spent his short adult life oscillating between the tournament circuit, which he was genuinely good at, and the political rebellions that his frustrated situation made almost inevitable, which he was consistently bad at. William was with him at the end, and what the sources record of those final days is poignant in a way that does not require embellishment. The dying prince, stripped of everything that rank and wealth had provided during his life, asked his most faithful knight to take his crusading cloak and carry it to Jerusalem. He had taken the crusading vow but would never fulfill it himself. He asked William to fulfill it for him. William was over 30, without a lord, without land, with his reputation as his only substantial asset. Going to Jerusalem was not the obvious career move. It was expensive, it was dangerous, and the Holy Land in the early 1180s was a place of serious military crisis, with Saladin consolidating his power in ways that would shortly lead to the catastrophe of Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem itself. What William would have known when he made the decision was that the Holy Land was difficult and far away, and that the pilgrimage would cost him time and money and opportunity that he could not easily replace. He went anyway. He had made a promise. He spent 2 years there, fighting alongside the military orders, visiting the holy sites, and acquiring in the process the specific combination of spiritual credibility and demonstrated physical courage that constituted the most complete version of the chivalric identity available to a man of his background. The pilgrimage was a public act in a way that required understanding. It was observed, remembered, and incorporated into the account of his life that circulated in the networks of the aristocratic world he inhabited. When he returned to England, he returned not just as a very good tournament fighter, but as a man who had demonstrated a quality of loyalty that went beyond professional obligation. Henry II received him, and after a period of careful mutual assessment, trusted him. He gave William land, arranged the marriage to Isabel de Clare, and incorporated him into the innermost circle of the royal household. For the first time in his life, William Marshal had an inheritance. Isabel de Clare deserves her own examination, because she was not simply the vehicle through which William acquired his estates. She was the daughter of Richard de Clare, Earl of Pembroke, known to later history as Strongbow, who had led the Anglo-Norman intervention in Ireland in the 1160s, and who had built a position in that country that was both extensive and politically complicated. Isabel had been in royal custody since her father's death, which was normal for heiresses, and she was probably in her early to mid-20s when Henry arranged her marriage to William. She came with Pembroke, with lands in Normandy and Ireland, and with the specific kind of political weight that large landholdings in multiple jurisdictions represented. The marriage transformed William from a successful landless knight into one of the significant landowners of the Anglo-Norman world in the space of a ceremony. There is evidence, scattered and indirect but persistent, that the marriage was something more than a political arrangement. Isabel appears in the records as an administrator of considerable competence, managing estates during the long periods when William was elsewhere on royal service or on campaign, and managing them well enough that the evidence of her management is visible in the documentary record rather than simply assumed. That this was the result of the specific capabilities she had developed rather than of William's direction from a distance seems likely from the context in which her decisions appear. She was capable, and the capability seems to have been acknowledged rather than resented. Henry II died in 1189 in the specific way of a man destroyed not by external enemies but by the people closest to him. The rebellion of his sons had been a recurring catastrophe of his reign, and the final iteration of it included his younger son John, whom Henry had believed loyal, joining the coalition against him. The news reached him near death, and by most accounts it was the news that broke him. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. William was present through the last days and the death, which was wretched and undomesticated and nothing like the formal royal departures that the ceremonial tradition preferred. He was also present for the moment afterward, when the new King Richard arrived and found that most of the household had already left, the practical desertion that always follows a dead patron. William stayed. This too was noticed. Richard was a man who paid his debts. He had a specific debt to William from a skirmish during the previous year's rebellion, when William had encountered the prince in the field and chosen to kill his horse rather than the man. This was technically a legitimate combat decision. An unhorsed opponent is removed from the engagement without the permanent consequences of death, but it was also, in context, clearly a choice rather than an accident. The prince was at William's mercy, and William chose to extend it. Richard, who was not sentimental but who was precise about obligation, remembered this with exactness. William's position in Richard's reign was secure in ways it had not been before, but it was also somewhat removed from the centre of affairs, because Richard's centre of affairs was the Third Crusade, which meant the Holy Land, not England. He governed his estates, maintained his relationships, and watched the political situation evolve with the attention of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that political stability is a temporary condition that requires constant maintenance, and that the preparations for its absence are best made before the absence arrives. Richard's captivity following the Crusade, held for ransom by the Duke of Austria and then the Holy Roman Emperor, was one of the more extraordinary episodes of the period. A king of England held in a castle in Central Europe, while the political situation in his kingdom teetered on the edge of the chaos that his brother John was actively encouraging. The ransom was enormous. Raising it required the English administrative machinery to function under the direction of people who were both competent and genuinely committed to Richard's return rather than his continued absence. Eleanor of Aquitaine led this effort with a focus and determination that her age, she was in her late 60s, made remarkable. William contributed financially and organisationally, and the ransom was raised and the king returned. Richard died in 1199 from a wound received at the siege of Chalus-Chabrol, struck by a crossbow bolt from the walls while he was surveying the defences without his usual armour, a lapse in caution that the legends of his recklessness had been predicting for years. The wound was treated incompetently and became infected, and he died 10 days later, leaving England to John, which was the outcome everyone with good judgment had been hoping to avoid, and everyone with accurate predictive capacity had been expecting. John was intelligent, suspicious, and possessed of a specific genius for transforming potential allies into enemies. He was also, in the specific sense that mattered most for the stability of his reign, unlucky. He inherited a set of challenges, including the ongoing military pressure from Philip of France and the structural tensions within the Anglo-Norman baronage, that would have required exceptional skill to manage, and he managed them with the combination of tactical cleverness and strategic self-destruction that characterized his career. William served him. This required patience of an unusual order, the kind that distinguishes loyalty to an institution and a kingdom from admiration of the person who happens to be occupying it. The loss of Normandy in 1204 was the defining catastrophe of John's reign, the moment at which the Anglo-Norman world, the political and cultural entity that had existed since the conquest, effectively ceased to be a coherent thing. Philip of France took the duchy in a campaign that John managed with a combination of military inadequacy and political failure that historians have been arguing about ever since. William lost his Norman lands but maintained his position in England, navigating the complicated dual loyalty of the next several years with the careful diplomatic agility of someone who understood that both kings needed him more than they needed his humiliation. John's relationship with his barons deteriorated through his reign in a way that was partly the natural consequence of bad governance, and partly the specific result of John's tendency to treat the mechanisms of law and custom as obstacles to his authority rather than as the foundations of it. Magna Carta in 1215 represented the barons' attempt to formalise the constraints that John had been systematically ignoring, and John's almost immediate disavowal of it after the military pressure that produced it eased represented his equally systematic commitment to ignoring those constraints whenever he could. The civil war that followed, complicated by the involvement of French Prince Louis, was still ongoing when John died in October of 1216, leaving a situation that most contemporaries assessed as approximately hopeless for his dynasty. William was 70 years old or thereabouts, because no one had kept precise track of the year of his birth. He was appointed Regent of England for the 9-year-old Henry III, with a kingdom at war, a French army in possession of significant portions of it, and a baronage divided between those who had already committed to Louis and those who were waiting to see which way the situation would go before committing to anything. The appointment was not made with universal enthusiasm. He was old. The task was enormous. The resources were inadequate. The political situation was as complicated as anything the medieval English polity had faced since the anarchy that had provided the backdrop for the first act of William's life. He did it anyway. He toured England in the grey autumn of 1216 as the regent of a child king whose prospects looked poor, rallying support with a combination of his personal authority, accumulated over decades, and a clear-eyed assessment of what the alternatives were. He negotiated with the baronage, he managed the military situation, he communicated with the Pope, whose support was not military, but was politically significant in ways that affected the legitimacy calculus. He kept the thing together. The Battle of Lincoln in May of 1217 was the turning point. The French-backed rebel forces had consolidated a position in Lincoln that gave them control of the city and appeared difficult to dislodge. William planned and led the relief of Lincoln in a way that demonstrated in his 7th decade the same qualities that had made him effective on the tournament circuit in his 20s: the careful reading of terrain and position, the patient preparation, the precise commitment of force at the point where it would be most effective. The battle, which the soldiers called the Fair of Lincoln with the bitter humour of people who have just fought through a city, was decisive. The rebel army was broken. Many of the significant rebel barons were captured. The French prince's position in England became untenable, and the subsequent peace negotiations produced a settlement that ended the conflict and secured the Angevin dynasty. He died in May of 1219, having held England together through the worst crisis of the century, and handed it back in better condition than he had received it. He had outlived 2 kings and most of the significant figures of his generation. He died in bed, which for a man who had spent his entire professional life in environments specifically designed to prevent dying in bed, was a notable achievement. He was buried at the Temple Church in London, as he had asked. The effigy that marks his resting place shows a face of remarkable composure, the expression of someone who has been in enough difficult situations over a long enough time that equanimity has become not an achievement, but a condition, the permanent baseline from which everything else is experienced. Around the year 1219, his squire said of him that he had never, in all their years together, seen him do anything that was not considered, measured, and deliberate. This from someone who had watched him fight in tournaments and in open battle, which means the observation is not about the absence of action, but about the quality of it. It was not restraint, it was precision. The application of exactly the right force to exactly the right point at exactly the right moment, with nothing wasted and nothing held back that was needed. It was, in the end, the only thing about him that was truly exceptional, and it turned out to be sufficient for everything. The specific details of William's training under de Tancarville reveal something about how the medieval system of knightly formation actually worked at its best, as distinct from how it worked on average. De Tancarville's household was a training environment of genuine quality, large enough to provide the range of experienced fighters and horses and equipment that proper training required, well connected enough to create the tournament opportunities that converted training into tested skill, and managed by a man who understood the difference between producing fighters and producing knights, which in the language of the period meant the difference between men who could use violence effectively and men who could use it within the social and ethical framework that the profession required. The distinction mattered. The tournament circuit would eventually establish which kind of man you were, because the circuit required not just fighting ability but the specific suite of social and financial skills that sustained a career over time, and fighters who lacked those skills tended to exit the profession in ways that were instructive to observe. William absorbed all of it. The physical formation was the part that the later accounts tend to emphasize, because it was the part that produced the most visible results: the tournament victories, the captures, the growing reputation that preceded him into engagements. But the social formation was equally important and considerably harder to see from the outside. He learned the specific courtesy of the tournament world, the formal exchanges before and after engagements, the ransom negotiations, the relationships with heralds and the procedures they administered, the obligations that arose between men who fought each other and then travelled the same circuit and encountered each other again at the next tournament. He learned how to be a reliable team fighter, which required a different set of qualities from individual combat excellence, and which was, in the team-based structure of the 12th century tournament, frequently more important. He learned when to commit and when to hold, which is perhaps the single most valuable lesson the circuit offered, and the one that the most raw talent most consistently failed to apply, because raw talent tends to produce the conviction that commitment is always the right choice, and that holding back is a failure of nerve rather than a strategic option. The social world of the tournament circuit was also a network of relationships and information that operated as a parallel structure to the formal political world, and that was in some respects more efficiently organised. Men who spent their professional lives travelling between the same set of venues, fighting the same opponents, staying in the same caravanserais and inns and temporary encampments, developed a set of relationships that crossed the political boundaries of the feudal structure in ways that the feudal structure itself could not produce. A knight in the household of a Flemish count might know the fighting styles and financial situations of men in the service of lords who were, formerly, political rivals, simply because they had been on the same tournament circuit for years. This knowledge was not neutral. It was the kind of knowledge that careful people used carefully. William used it carefully. By his middle years on the circuit, the period roughly from his mid-20s through his mid-30s, he had built a network of relationships that extended across the major tournament regions of northern France and England. Fighters he had trained alongside, men he had captured and ransomed and therefore developed a specific kind of credit with. People in the households of significant lords who knew his name and would speak well of him when speaking well of him served their lord's interests or their own. The reputation was the foundation of the career, but the reputation rested on relationships, and the relationships rested on the accumulated evidence of reliable behaviour over many years and many encounters. There was also the question of how he handled the proceeds. Tournament fighting was a profession, and like any profession, its long-term viability depended on financial management as much as technical performance. Men who won frequently but spent carelessly found themselves in the same constrained position as men who won less frequently but managed well, which is to say the position of needing to keep performing at a high level to maintain an adequate cash flow, with no reserve to manage the inevitable bad periods. Horses got injured, equipment needed replacement. Illness or injury could take a fighter off the circuit for months. The men who built durable careers were not necessarily the most talented on the field, they were often the most disciplined off it, and William appears to have been both. His relationship with the young King Henry developed over several years into something that the sources suggest was more than the usual household knight dynamic. The young king was, by all accounts, personally charming in the way that royal persons with excellent social skills and no actual authority sometimes are. Attentive, generous, warm in his immediate relationships, and capable of inspiring genuine loyalty in the people around him, even when the larger strategic picture of his situation was discouraging. He valued William not just as a champion, but as a companion in the full sense, and William responded with the specific loyalty of a man who takes personal obligations seriously when the personal relationship is genuine. This loyalty was tested during the rebellion of 1173 and 1174, when the young king joined his brothers Richard and Geoffrey in revolt against their father Henry II. The rebellion was poorly managed and ended in failure, and William stayed throughout it, not because the cause was clearly right, but because his lord was committed to it, and abandoning a lord in the middle of a campaign, whatever the justification, would have produced a stain on his reputation that subsequent good behaviour could not easily remove. He emerged from the aftermath in a complicated position, technically on the wrong side of a failed rebellion against the king, but with a record of personal loyalty that the king could recognise even when the cause it had served was not one the king approved of. Henry II was, among his other qualities, a good judge of men, and he recognised what William's behaviour had demonstrated. The accusation that followed, probably in the mid-1170s, was of the kind that was particularly dangerous in the culture of the tournament world and the courtly tradition, where the connection between a knight and his lord's wife was simultaneously a charged social ideal and a genuine threat to the household's stability. The accusation came from men within the young king's household who understood that it was both plausible within the conventions of courtly culture and essentially impossible to definitively disprove, which made it exactly the kind of accusation that the people making it preferred. It worked, at least temporarily. William was distanced from the household. He returned to the circuit as an independent fighter, which was a demotion in status and in financial stability, and he did this with what the sources suggest was outward composure, even if the internal experience was different. He continued to fight well. He continued to build his reputation, and eventually the young king, who had the specific capacity for generous feeling that sometimes produces genuine reassessments rather than just formal pardons, came back to him. The specific sequence of events is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts, but the shape is. The accusation was addressed, William was received back, and the relationship resumed. He was with the young king until the end. That continuity, maintained through the rupture and the separation and the formal reconciliation, was itself evidence of the quality that his later career would repeatedly demonstrate: the capacity to stay in relationship with difficult situations and with difficult people until the relationship resolved into something viable, because abandoning the situation before that resolution was both personally costly and, for someone who took loyalty seriously, morally unacceptable. After the young king's death, the 2 years in Jerusalem were not a pause in his career but a continuation of it by other means. The Holy Land in the early 1180s was a place of genuine military crisis, with Saladin having consolidated his position in ways that made the Latin states increasingly vulnerable. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, were the primary fighting forces maintaining what stability remained, and William fought alongside them, which meant fighting in a context where the strategic stakes were considerably higher and the resources considerably more limited than anything the tournament circuit had presented. He was good at this too. He was good at the specific adaptation of his skills to different contexts that the various phases of his career had required him to make, which is perhaps the single most useful quality for a professional life that spans 7 decades and multiple entirely different sets of circumstances. When he returned to England, the world he returned to was different from the one he had left. Henry II was ageing, his relations with his sons in the complicated middle period between the failed rebellion and the final one. The political landscape was shifting. The men who had been the dominant figures of his youth were dying or already gone. The networks that William had built were maturing into something more durable and more valuable than the tournament friendships of his early years, because the men in those networks had themselves risen in the world, and their patronage and their goodwill were now worth more than the equivalent goodwill of 20 years earlier. Isabel de Clare, whom William married in 1189 at Henry's arrangement, brought into the marriage not just land and wealth, but a specific kind of political complexity, because the Irish territories that came with her name were contested and required active management in ways that English landholding did not. The Anglo-Norman position in Ireland, established through the conquest led by her father Strongbow in the 1160s, was never fully secure. The native Irish lords were not reconciled. The relationship between the Anglo-Norman settlers and the English crown was complicated by questions of authority and jurisdiction, and the practical administration of estates in multiple countries across significant distances required organisational capacity that William developed by necessity. He was in Ireland several times during the years of his marriage, dealing with the specific problems of a conquered territory that had not finished being conquered, and he managed the Irish estates with the same practical intelligence he brought to everything else. Not perfectly, not without conflict, but effectively enough that the holdings remained viable and grew over time rather than diminishing. The story of what an individual builds from nothing gives way naturally to the story of the system that made that building possible. Because William Marshal did not emerge from a vacuum, he emerged from the tournament circuit, that sprawling, dangerous, financially complex institution that was the primary training ground and economic engine of the medieval knightly class, and that looked from a distance like a sport and felt from the inside like something considerably more serious. And if you want to understand what the tournament circuit was, there is only one way to do it properly, which is to be on it. You have been standing in this field since before sunrise, and you are already tired, which is not the condition you were hoping to arrive in. The journey here took 3 days, which was unremarkable in itself, but the road for the last day was bad in the way that autumn roads in northern France tend to be bad, which is to say rutted and wet and in the specific state of controlled deterioration that means it has been used heavily without being maintained adequately for several seasons. Your horse picked up something in its right foreleg on the second day, not lame, not visibly compromised, but moving with a slight unevenness that you have been watching and worrying about ever since. Because your horse is approximately half of your professional operation, and any deterioration in its condition is a direct deterioration in your prospects for the day. The field itself is good or good enough, which means it's reasonably flat, not actively waterlogged, and large enough that the initial engagement will have room to develop properly before everyone runs into the far boundary and is forced to either turn or stop. Tournaments of this period, the middle of the 12th century, do not happen in enclosed arenas with clear boundaries and formal rules about where the action can go. They happen on whatever ground is available within an agreed general region, which can extend across several miles of open countryside, through the edges of villages whose inhabitants have been advised to make themselves scarce, along riverbanks and through orchards, and occasionally into and out of the kind of terrain that your horse is significantly better at managing than you would be on foot. The landscape is the playing field, and the playing field changes as the engagement develops, which means the strategy changes as the landscape changes, which means you cannot prepare for all of it and must be ready for any of it. Your equipment is good by the standards of what you can currently afford. The Haube Géant is your most important possession in any world that contains people trying to harm you, and it is in good condition. You spent several evenings last week working through it link by link, the way you were taught, feeling for the weak spots and the stretched rings, and the places where a strike at the wrong angle might find a gap. You found 2 places that needed attention, and the smith addressed them. It is as reliable as regular care and material integrity can make it, which is not a guarantee but is considerably better than nothing. The gambeson underneath it is heavy and already warm, which will be an advantage when you are active, and a disadvantage during the waiting periods that tournaments inevitably contain, when the overheating from the initial engagement begins to dissipate, and leaves you slightly clammy and colder than you would be if you were wearing something designed for standing around rather than for fighting. This is an accepted aspect of the situation. You stopped expecting comfort in your equipment around your 3rd year doing this professionally. Your helmet is a close-fitting iron cap with a nasal bar, practical rather than elaborate, which is a choice that balances protection with visibility and weight. There are heavier helmets available, enclosing more of the head and face, and they offer more protection against direct strikes to the face. They also restrict your vision to a degree that you find more dangerous than the increased protection justifies. This is a personal calculus that every fighter makes differently based on their style and their experience of what the specific threats in their specific practice of combat tend to be. Your style depends on seeing clearly and reacting quickly, and you have decided that the vision is worth more than the additional coverage. You might be wrong. You have been wrong before. Your team is assembled near the horses at the far edge of the gathering area, and you move toward them now with the specific attention of someone taking a final inventory before something that cannot be undone begins. Renault is there, already in his equipment and already running the visual assessment that experienced fighters run before any engagement, watching the opposing teams, identifying the horses, cataloguing the equipment, making the preliminary calculations about which opponents represent the best combination of value and manageable risk. Renault has been doing this for 15 years, and his preliminary calculations are usually accurate in ways that take skill of a different kind from the fighting itself to develop and maintain. There are 5 of you today, not the 6 that you prefer for this kind of field. The 6th man, Jacques, is absent because his horse developed a definitive lameness on the road 2 days ago, and he made the decision that coming without his horse was more dangerous than not coming at all, which is correct. A tournament fighter without a horse is not a tournament fighter. He is a target. The 4 of you who are present adjust the team strategy to account for the gap, which means slightly more conservative positioning in the initial engagement and a heavier reliance on the coordination between you rather than on numbers. Gilles, who's the youngest of you and who has been on the circuit for 2 years, is visibly tense in the way that being young enough to still feel fear as something fresh and specific produces visible tension. You do not say anything about this to him because addressing it directly would make it worse, and because the tension will resolve itself the moment the engagement begins, when the immediacy of the situation replaces the anticipation. You know this because you remember the specific texture of those first tournaments when the waiting was the hardest part. It still is, sometimes. You have simply gotten better at not showing it. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. Thomas is checking his lance for the 3rd time since you arrived, which is the kind of repetitive checking that means he is processing something specific and needs to be left alone to process it. The lance is fine. It was fine the first time he checked it. Watching him check it a 3rd time, you resist the impulse to say this, because what he needs right now is to check the lance a 3rd time, and saying it is fine does not help with whatever the checking is actually doing for him. The heralds who administer a tournament of this scale are a profession within the profession, and understanding them is essential to understanding how the system actually works, as distinct from how it is described to people who are not inside it. The heraldic function in the 12th century encompasses multiple roles: the formal identification of fighters by their emblems and devices, the witnessing and recording of captures for legal enforceability purposes, the mediation of disputes that arise during or after an engagement, and the administration of the ransom negotiations that are the financial core of the enterprise. A herald at a major tournament is simultaneously a civil registry officer, a legal official, an enforcement mechanism, and a court of first instance for disputes that the combatants cannot resolve themselves. They are treated with the specific courtesy that their function requires, which is real but also self-interested. A fighter who disrespects the heralds is a fighter who has made the financial infrastructure of the circuit hostile to his interests, which is the kind of mistake that experienced fighters do not make, and that beginners make exactly once. The ransom negotiations that follow a capture are more structured than the formal descriptions suggest and more flexible than the formal structures imply. The official rule is that the captured fighter's ransom is to be set at a level that is significant but not ruinous, which sounds clear until you realize that significant and ruinous are relative to the financial position of the fighter being ransomed, which the captor may not know precisely, and that the negotiation therefore involves a rapid, informal assessment of the other party's situation, conducted through the specific language of the exchange, the speed of the initial offer, the nature of the counteroffer, the quality of the equipment being offered in partial payment, and various other indicators that an experienced fighter has learned to read. The negotiation is fast, conducted under time pressure, and produces results that both parties will live with for months or years afterward, because the ransom relationship creates an ongoing social obligation between the captor and the captured that persists beyond the immediate transaction. This is one of the details of tournament culture that the later, more theatrical version of the institution obscured: the social dimension of the ransom relationship. A knight who had been captured by another knight, and who had given his word on the terms of his ransom, was in a relationship with his captor that was acknowledged in subsequent encounters. He might become a regular opponent on the circuit, or might join the same team for a future engagement, or might become a source of information about conditions in a region he knew well. The ransom was the mechanism, but the relationship was the product, and the relationship, maintained with appropriate courtesy on both sides, was part of the network that sustained a career over the years. The horses deserve more attention than they typically receive in the historical accounts, for the same reason the accounts underrepresent the administrative mourning and the cold pottage. They are present throughout and therefore easy to treat as background rather than subject. But the horse is not background. The horse is the primary instrument of the fighter's professional existence, the asset around which the economics of the career are organised, the variable whose condition most directly determines the outcomes of any given engagement, and the responsibility whose management occupies a significant portion of every day that does not involve active fighting. A good tournament horse was a specific kind of animal, trained to the specific behaviours that mounted combat required, and that were different from the behaviours required for travel or hunting, or the other uses horses were put to. It needed to move at speed toward other horses and men without shying, to respond correctly to the leg pressures and weight shifts that were the fighter's primary controls during an engagement when both hands were occupied with weapons, to turn quickly and reliably in response to those controls, to maintain its composure in the specific chaos of noise and movement and impact that a tournament engagement produced. These behaviours were trained rather than innate, which meant they were the result of time and skill and patience applied consistently over months or years, which meant they had economic value proportional to the investment they represented, which meant the horse was simultaneously an asset, a responsibility, and a liability in ways that were constantly present in every fighter's calculations. Your current horse is good, or has been good, and the four-leg concern that you noted on the road is the specific anxiety of someone whose professional survival depends on an animal that cannot communicate its internal state directly, and that you must therefore read through external signs. The slight unevenness was not severe enough to be definitively alarming, and not slight enough to be definitively reassuring. This is the worst condition, the threshold where judgment is required and where the judgment has real consequences. You watched it throughout the engagement today, assessing it after each major effort, and it seems to have held. The horse you're riding home is better than the one you arrived with, which means the immediate problem is solved, and the longer-term question of what is happening with the original horse becomes something to address in the week before the next tournament, rather than an emergency requiring attention tonight. The question of what happens when you can no longer compete at the level the circuit requires is one that every fighter on the circuit carries somewhere in their thinking, at a depth proportional to how far from that point they currently are. For the young fighters, it is theoretical. For men in their middle career, it is abstract. For men past their peak, it is a practical problem with a timeline that is not clearly defined, and that the body provides evidence about in ways that require interpretation rather than simple reading. You're not past your peak, but you are not at it either. The peak was several years ago, at the specific moment when the physical capacity was fully developed and the experience was fully applied, and the combination produced results that have not quite been matched since. This is not failure, it is the normal trajectory. But it is also a clock, ticking at a rate you cannot precisely measure, toward a transition that you will need to manage deliberately rather than arriving at by accident. The heralds are visible at the far end of the field, conducting the preliminary negotiations and certifications that precede any formal tournament engagement, verifying identities, recording team compositions, noting equipment, and ensuring that both sides have agreed on the basic terms under which the day will operate. These terms are not complicated in principle, which is that any fighter who is unhorsed or who yields is under the control of the fighter who captured him until his ransom is negotiated and paid, that the ransom is to be set within reasonable bounds, that the captured fighter's life and basic dignity are to be respected, and that the proceedings of the day are to be witnessed and attested by the heralds in ways that make the financial claims legally enforceable afterward. The complexity is in the application of these terms to the specific circumstances that arise during an engagement that has no script and no referee, and that covers several miles of ground with several hundred participants. And this is why the heralds exist and why their function requires skilled and respected individuals to perform it. You watch the opposing teams assemble, and you watch them with the same attention that Renault is applying to the assessment, because tournament fighting is as much a matter of knowing who you are dealing with before the engagement begins as it is of what you do during it. You recognise several of the fighters from previous tournaments. The large man on the black horse near the far left is from a Flemish contingent that you encountered twice last spring. Reliable fighters who work in tight coordinated pairs and who are difficult to break up once they establish their pattern. The group of four just behind the standard are from a Burgundian household that has been on the circuit for 3 years, and that has been getting progressively more dangerous as they learn from experience what the Flemish group already knows. There are several men you do not recognise, which means either they are new to the circuit, or they have been working a different region and are appearing here for the first time. New fighters are sometimes easier than experienced ones, and sometimes significantly harder, because their patterns are unknown and unknown patterns take longer to read. The signal is given without ceremony, which is the norm rather than an exception. The tournament begins not with a formal declaration, but with the kind of mutual recognition that both sides have been preparing for the same engagement and that the preparation is complete. You move. The initial charge is the moment when all the planning encounters the reality of what a field full of mounted men in motion actually looks like and sounds like, which is simultaneously more chaotic and more ordered than it appears from the outside. There is noise, the collective noise of horses and men and metal, that has a physical quality to it, something you feel as much as hear. There is a movement that your body has done enough times to respond to with something that is almost reflex but not quite. A series of adjustments and decisions that happen faster than conscious choice, but that are not entirely automatic either. A middle ground that years of training have built and that you inhabit during a fight in a way you do not inhabit it at any other time. You are through the initial engagement before you have a clear account of what happened in it. This is normal. The first contact of a tournament engagement is too fast and too complex to track narratively as it happens. The tracking comes later, when you reconstruct it from fragments and from what your body did rather than from any continuous conscious observation. What you know, on the other side of it, is that you are still mounted, that your horse is responding correctly beneath you, and that you have not taken any direct strikes that have compromised your ability to continue, which is the minimum successful outcome of an initial engagement. You are looking for Renault, who was to your left when the signal came, and who is now somewhere in the middle of the field dealing with something you cannot see from your current position. You find Thomas first, who has made a capture, his first of the day, a young fighter whose horse you can see standing riderless 20 feet away, while the formalities of the surrender are being conducted. You note this without breaking your own movement, because acknowledging Thomas's success is for later, after the field is finished, and interrupting your own assessment to celebrate it now would be the kind of distraction that costs you. The field in the middle of an engagement is a complex and rapidly changing environment that requires you to hold several things in your attention simultaneously: your immediate surroundings, the broader state of the field, the position of your teammates, the position of your most significant opponents, the condition of your horse, and the state of your own body. The body assessment is the one that gets neglected most easily when things are going well, and that turns out to be the most important one when things are going less well, because the body deteriorates during a tournament fight in ways that happen gradually and that you stop noticing when your attention is elsewhere, and a body that has deteriorated to a certain point becomes a liability rather than an asset without necessarily signalling when the transition occurred. You find your first target after 7 or 8 minutes of movement across the field, which feels much shorter and slightly longer than it sounds when described. He is from one of the Burgundian group, a mid-sized man on a good horse, fighting currently without immediate backup, which means either his team has been broken up or he has moved ahead of them in a way that was intentional or a way that was not. The horse is better than his equipment suggests it should be, which is useful information. It means the horse was either captured at a previous tournament, which implies he has been on the circuit for a while, or it was borrowed for this engagement, which implies he is working with someone else's resources and may not be as well capitalized as the horse would suggest. Neither of these is a problem. Both of them affect how the capture negotiation will go if you reach it. You approach from an angle that requires him to turn his horse, and the turn costs him a moment of positional disadvantage that you use to close the distance faster than he can reset his orientation. Your lance connects with his shield above the grip, at an angle that transfers the force upward rather than directly back, and the combination of the impact and his horse's continued movement in the wrong direction takes him over the back of the saddle in the specific way that unhorsings happen when they are done properly, which is quickly and with enough momentum that the landing, while unpleasant, is controlled enough not to cause serious injury. He is down. His horse stops, confused by the sudden absence of a rider. You dismount, tether your horse loosely to a branch at the field's edge, and walk to him with the specific pace of someone conducting a formal rather than an urgent proceeding, because the formality is part of the procedure, and rushing it sends the wrong signals. He is sitting up. He is not seriously injured, which you can tell from the way he is sitting, and the quality of his attention, which is oriented outward rather than inward in the way of someone dealing with pain rather than damage. He is also, which becomes clear as you reach him, younger than you thought from a distance. Probably not more than 20, which means this is likely his second or third tournament, which explains the good horse and the solitary fighting style, both of which are the choices of someone who has not yet developed the team instincts that the circuit eventually teaches. The formal words are exchanged. He yields. He acknowledges your capture. You claim his horse and his armour and request his word on a ransom, which he gives, naming a figure that is slightly below what you would ideally ask for, but that is within the range you would have accepted if he had offered it without negotiation. You do not negotiate. The figure is reasonable for his situation and for the day, and spending the time to push it higher costs more in opportunity than the difference in ransom would recover. You take his word, leave him in the temporary custody of a nearby herald who has been observing the exchange, and remount. You find Renaud 20 minutes later on the far side of the field, where he has been working with Gilles in the tight two-man coordination that experienced fighters can maintain in the chaos of a large engagement, and that produces disproportionate results relative to what either fighter could achieve independently. They have made 2 captures between them. You compare notes quickly, identify the remaining significant targets, and adjust your movements for the afternoon. The afternoon is longer and physically harder. The field thins as captures accumulate and men withdraw to the area where the ransoms are being processed, but the men who remain are the ones who have not been captured, which means they are either the best fighters or the luckiest, and both of those categories present a harder challenge than the average of the morning. Your arms are tired. Your horse is developing a slight unsteadiness in its stride that may be the foreleg issue you noticed on the road, or may simply be fatigue, and distinguishing between the two in real time, while also maintaining everything else your attention needs to cover, is one of those difficulties that does not feature prominently in the descriptions of tournament fighting, but that is a constant presence in the actual experience of it. You make one more capture late in the afternoon, a larger man whose horse is considerably better than your own current animal, and who agrees, after the exchange of formal words, to a ransom that includes the horse in partial payment. This is the best outcome. Not just a financial settlement, but an improvement to your own operational capacity, because the horse you will ride home is demonstrably superior to the horse you rode here, which means next month's engagement begins from a stronger position than this one. Renaud calls the team together as the sun is moving toward the trees. The field still has activity in it, but the remaining combatants are not producing the kind of returns that justify continuing to engage when your horses are tired and your own capacity is at a level that makes risks harder to manage than they were in the morning. This is the math of the circuit, and Renaud applies it without sentiment. When the calculation no longer favours continuing, you stop. The discipline of stopping when stopping is correct is as important as the discipline of continuing when continuing is correct, and the fighters who do not develop this discipline tend to end their careers in the specific way of someone who pushed for one more engagement when the conditions required a different assessment. You ride back through the field's aftermath together. It looks less dramatic than it should. Churned ground, some abandoned equipment, the distant sound of ransoms being processed and horses being moved. Nobody is dead today. Several people are injured, but not seriously. The heralds are completing their records with the focused efficiency of their profession, and the captured knights are being treated with the courtesy that the system requires, because the system requires it not for sentimental reasons, but for practical ones, and everyone involved understands this. The accounting happens that evening in the tent that Renaud's household has established near the field. The food is better than expected, and you eat without much attention to it, because your body at this point simply needs fuel and does not have strong opinions about the quality of that fuel. The numbers are worked through with the precision that the shared risk structure of team fighting requires: expenses, captures, ransoms, shared liabilities, individual accounts. Your position has improved by enough that the journey here was financially worth making, and that the next journey becomes possible with a slightly improved starting point. The horse is better, the account is better. These are the increments from which a career is built month by month and field by field when the career is being built correctly. What you do not think about, or try not to think about, is that this is a young man's profession, and you are not as young as you were, and that the margin between a good performance and a bad one is narrower than it used to be, and that the bad performances are more costly than they were in the early years, both financially and physically. You think about it anyway, in the quiet moments between the eating and the sleeping and the reviewing of the day's decisions, because the thought presents itself regardless of whether you invite it. You set it aside. There are 2 more tournaments before the winter break, and the winter break is when you reassess. You sleep well that night. which is the specific and reliable reward of a body that has been fully extended and that has earned rest in the most direct way available, by doing the work completely and by being still when the work is done. The tournament circuit was, among other things, an engine for testing the distance between what the chivalric code required and what the circumstances of professional violence actually permitted. Every day on that circuit was a small and ongoing negotiation between the ideal and the practical, between what the song said knighthood was and what knighthood actually involved when you were managing a horse's lameness and calculating whether a specific capture was worth the risk of exposing your left flank, which brings us by natural progression to the code itself, the official version, the written down version, the version that everyone cited and almost no one followed completely, and that shaped the world anyway. The ideal of chivalry was codified, celebrated, and almost immediately complicated by the gap between what it required and what the world actually demanded of the people supposed to be following it. This is not a cynical observation, or not only that, it is what happens when any serious moral code meets actual human life, which has a reliable tendency to present situations that the code's framers did not fully anticipate. The interesting question is not whether the chivalric code was lived up to, because it was not consistently, not by anyone. The interesting question is what the code actually was, how it developed, what it was trying to achieve, and what it produced in the space between the aspiration and the practice. The word chivalry enters the historical record gradually, rooted in the French word for horse, which tells you something important about its origins. The concept did not begin with theology or philosophy. It began with the practical military reality of mounted warfare, the specific culture that developed around the training, maintenance, and deployment of men on horseback in a world where that combination represented the most significant military technology available. The horseman, the chevalier, the knight, was a military specialist whose formation required years of intensive training and whose equipment, the horse, the armour, the weapons, required considerable wealth to acquire and maintain. The code that developed around him was in significant part a response to the social and economic problem of having large numbers of heavily armed, expensively trained, professionally violent men moving through a society that needed them to function as defenders rather than threats. Left entirely to their own devices, these men were dangerous. Not necessarily dangerous in the sense of deliberately malicious, though some were, but dangerous in the sense of being capable of violence that the surrounding society could not easily resist, and that the social stability everyone depended on could not survive if it became general. The chivalric code was one of several mechanisms, alongside feudal oaths, church sanctions, and the legal structures of landholding and inheritance, that attempted to channel this capacity for violence into forms that served the existing social order rather than destabilizing it. What the code said in its various articulations through the literature and the advisory texts and the ceremonial language of dubbing and oath-taking was something like this. A knight was to be brave in battle, loyal to his lord, generous to those weaker than himself, courteous in his dealings with social equals, protective of the church and of those who could not protect themselves, and above all these things, he was to pursue honourable conduct in all his actions, measuring himself not just by outcomes but by the manner of their achievement. These were not modest claims. They were, in fact, claims that required a person of exceptional and consistent moral quality to fulfill even approximately, and the medieval world, like every other world, contained a normal distribution of moral quality rather than an unusual abundance of exceptional virtue. Most knights were ordinary people with the specific skills of their profession, varying in character from genuinely admirable to genuinely terrible, with the majority living somewhere in the complicated middle. The loyalty clause was perhaps the most immediately complicated of the code's requirements, because it sounded simple and was not. A knight owed loyalty to his lord. This seems clear until you remember that the feudal system of the high medieval period frequently placed men in situations of competing loyalty, owing service to two lords whose interests conflicted, or to a lord whose demands exceeded what honour permitted to provide, or to a lord who had himself acted dishonourably in ways that called the entire obligation into question. The theoretical resolution of these conflicts was worked through carefully in the legal and philosophical literature of the period, producing a sophisticated body of reasoning about which obligations took precedence, what constituted sufficient breach of the lord's obligations to release the knight's corresponding obligations, and how competing claims were to be weighted against each other. The practical resolution was usually messier. It involved a great deal of situational negotiation, quiet repositioning, the maintenance of relationships with multiple parties simultaneously, and occasionally the kind of choice between conflicting loyalties that everyone in the room agreed to interpret generously afterward, regardless of what had actually happened. William Marshal navigated several of these choices during his career, sometimes with results that were easier to defend than others, and his willingness to maintain the formal relationship with John during the worst of John's reign is the example that historians have found most revealing. A man of genuine principle, finding his way through a situation that genuine principle alone could not resolve, because the world in which that principle had to operate was not organised to make it easy. The treatment of prisoners is one of the clearest windows into the working gap between the chivalric ideal and the practiced reality, because it is an area where the ideal was both clearly stated and frequently tested in documented contexts. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The code required that a defeated opponent be treated with courtesy, his life to be respected, his ransom set at a level that was significant but not ruinous, his person to be kept in conditions appropriate to his rank. This was not purely idealistic, and understanding why it was not purely idealistic helps explain why it was observed as often as it was. The prisoner of appropriate rank was a financial asset. His ransom was real income, and a prisoner who died in custody was income that was not collected. The tournament circuit formalised this into an explicit commercial framework, but the same logic applied in actual warfare. Ransom was a significant component of the economics of medieval campaigning, and the customary protections that went with captivity made the system work for everyone who participated in it. And yet prisoners were killed. Not as the norm, not in the standard cases where the code's requirements were most directly applicable, but in the margins, in the cases where captives became a military liability, where the cost of managing them outweighed the eventual ransom income, where personal enmity or political calculation made the usual courtesy feel insufficient. The chronicles record this plainly, not as violations being shamefully admitted, but as operational decisions being reported, which tells you something about the gap between the formal ideal and the working understanding of the people inside the system. The gap was not invisible. It was acknowledged, at least implicitly, by everyone who navigated it. The protection of the weak, one of the most prominent of the code's requirements in the formal literature, had a specific and limited scope in practice that the general formulation obscured. Knights were expected to protect the church and its personnel, to protect women of appropriate social standing, to protect pilgrims on recognised routes, to defend the helpless from the predations of the ruthless. These were genuine obligations, observed with varying consistency, and the stories of their fulfilment were the stories that the literature celebrated and that gave the ideal its continuing power. What the obligation did not extend to, in any practically meaningful way, was the agricultural population that worked the land and that bore the costs of military conflict in the most direct terms. The chevauchée, the large-scale raiding tactic developed systematically in the 100 Years' War and used with devastating effect across the preceding centuries in various forms, was conducted by knights who understood exactly what it was doing, destroying crops, burning villages, killing livestock, driving populations from their homes, and in doing so destroying the economic basis of the opposing lord's ability to continue fighting. This was considered strategically legitimate. The protective requirements of the chivalric code were not considered to apply in this context, or were considered to be overridden by military necessity, or were simply not considered at all when the people being harmed were peasants rather than persons of quality. The question of women and the chivalric code occupies a specific and revealing position in the gap between the ideal and the practice. The formal ideal, developed through the troubadour tradition of southern France and elaborated in the courtly literature of the 12th and 13th centuries, placed a significant emphasis on the knight's relationship to noble women, the obligation to honour, protect, and serve them, the association between knightly virtue and the inspiration and approval of a worthy lady, the entire elaborate framework of courtly love that surrounded and shaped the public culture of the aristocratic world. This was a real cultural force. It shaped how people thought about gender and desire and the obligations that existed between men and women of quality. It produced literature of genuine sophistication and occasionally genuine beauty. It also existed in a social context in which women of noble birth had limited formal legal status, in which marriage was an economic and political arrangement made by their families without necessarily prioritizing their preferences, in which a widow's rights to her property were legally precarious in ways that required constant legal defense, and in which the same cultural tradition that idealized the noble lady's inspiration also regulated her behavior in ways that served the interests of the men around her rather than her own. The courtly love tradition's insistence on the knight's service to the lady was real, but it coexisted with a legal and social structure in which the lady's actual autonomy was significantly constrained, and the relationship between the cultural ideal and the social reality was not one of contradiction, but of complementarity. The one provided the language of elevation and honour, and the other provided the actual distribution of power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, encountered briefly in a previous episode of this channel's history, is the most visible example of what happened when a woman of exceptional capability and will encountered this combination of cultural elevation and practical constraint, and the story of her life is partly a story about the chivalric code's actual position on women, which was considerably more complicated than the formal rhetoric suggested. She was admired, celebrated, idealized, and also imprisoned. The imprisonment is the part the code did not have a consistent response to, because the code that required protection of noble women was administered by the same men who benefited from controlling them, and when those two imperatives conflicted, the conflict resolved in the direction that the distribution of power suggested it would. The code's requirements around generosity, one of the cardinal virtues in the formal literature, provide another window into the working relationship between aspiration and practice. A knight was to be generous, giving freely to those who needed, supporting the poor and the church, dispensing hospitality to travellers and followers with an open hand. This virtue had genuine expression in the aristocratic culture of the period, particularly in the household economy, where the Lord's table was a literal enactment of generosity, feeding not just the household, but extending hospitality to visitors in ways that were both genuinely charitable and politically functional. The lord who kept an open table was maintaining his reputation and his network simultaneously with the same action. The practical limits of this generosity were the limits of the resource base that supported it. A lord who gave more than his revenue could sustain was not generous, but irresponsible, and the tournaments that William Marshal competed in were partly about generating the resource base that made practical generosity possible. A knight without adequate resources could not fulfill the generosity requirements of the code, which meant that the code's requirements around generosity were implicitly dependent on the financial mechanisms of the profession, including the tournament circuit which the church wanted to ban. The generosity that the religious dimension of the code required was subsidized by the martial activities that the same religious dimension condemned. This was not a secret. It was simply a contradiction that the system contained and managed through the availability of dispensation and forgiveness. The literary tradition that shaped and transmitted the chivalric ideal deserves specific attention because it was not simply a reflection of the culture, but an active shaper of it. The romances, the chansons de geste, the troubadour poetry, these were not simply entertainment. They were the mechanism by which the ideals were articulated, circulated, and continuously renewed. A young man growing up in an aristocratic household in the 12th century encountered the chivalric ideal first through its literary expressions, through the stories of Roland and Lancelot and the other figures who embodied the code in its most elevated form, and the encounter shaped his understanding of what he was supposed to become before he had any direct experience of what the profession actually required. This was both the strength and the complication of the literary tradition's role. It set expectations that the real world consistently failed to meet, which could produce the specific kind of disillusionment that people who took the ideal seriously sometimes experienced when the practice showed its full complexity. But it also maintained the aspiration in the face of the practice, providing a language for talking about what good behaviour looked like even in situations where good behaviour was not what was happening, and creating the social obligation to at least gesture toward the ideal, even when the gesture was all that circumstances permitted. The chronicles of the later medieval period, written by men who had been educated in the same literary tradition and who were trying to make sense of the events they were recording, show this dynamic clearly. The tension between the narrative of chivalric behaviour they wanted to construct and the actual behaviour they were observing, and their various strategies for managing that tension, which ranged from emphasizing the positive cases to contextualizing the negative ones, to occasionally acknowledging with a kind of weary honesty that the ideal and the practice had once again failed to converge. This is perhaps the most jarring of the code's gaps for a modern reader, because it sits at the centre of what the code was ostensibly about, which was the protection of those who could not protect themselves. The peasants who could not protect themselves from a chevauché were, by the formal requirements of the code, exactly the people it was supposed to defend. The reasons they were not defended in practice are structural rather than simply hypocritical. The code was developed by and for the knightly class. The protection it offered was calibrated to the relationships and obligations that the knightly class had toward each other and toward the institutions they operated within, and the agricultural population, while necessary, was not part of those relationships in the ways that triggered the code's most active provisions. The courtesy requirements of the code governed how knights treated each other in formal social contexts, and these were genuinely observed with considerable regularity, for the straightforward reason that they served clear social functions. The elaborate courtesies of greeting and precedence, of formal speech and regulated behaviour in public settings, were the mechanisms by which a group of armed and potentially dangerous men managed their relationships with each other in circumstances that did not require violence. Breaking these courtesies was an insult, and in a world where insults had to be answered or accepted as status reductions, maintaining them was practical safety management as much as genuine politeness. The courtesy was real. Its scope was limited to the social world in which the knights operated, which was not the whole world but was the world they moved in daily, and that their code addressed. The religious dimension of chivalry deserves separate attention, because it is the part most easily misread in both directions, either as cynical window dressing on what was fundamentally a martial culture, or as the sincere core of the enterprise that the martial culture was built around. The reality is more complicated than either. The church had a genuine stake in shaping the behaviour of the military classes, partly because the church's physical safety and material interests depended on that behaviour being manageable, and partly because the theological logic of a Christian warrior culture, fighting in defence of Christendom with divine sanction, was something that church thinkers developed with considerable sophistication and that genuinely motivated many of the men who participated in the crusading enterprise, at least in its early decades. The problem was that a genuine theology of holy war, applied to the actual circumstances of military life, produced the same gaps and compromises that every other dimension of the chivalric code produced. Crusaders who fought with sincere religious conviction also looted. They also massacred. They also traded with the same Muslim merchants whose co-religionists they were fighting, because the economic logic of the region required it, and because the emotional logic of genuine faith did not always override the practical logic of sustaining yourself in the field. The church managed this with the theological equivalent of the code's social management, issuing guidance, providing mechanisms for confession and absolution, and accepting that the ideal could not be fully realised while maintaining its value as an aspiration toward which behaviour could be directed even if it could never be entirely achieved. The attempted bans on tournaments provide one of the clearest case studies in the relationship between the code's official requirements and its practiced reality. The church began issuing prohibitions on tournaments in the 12th century and continued issuing them for over 100 years with no meaningful effect on the actual frequency or character of tournaments. The reasons for the prohibitions were logical. Tournaments killed people, drew resources and attention away from the crusading enterprise, cultivated a culture of martial pride that operated independently of religious sanction, and in general represented the martial energy of the knightly class pursuing its own agenda rather than the agenda that the church preferred it to pursue. The reasons the prohibitions failed were equally logical. Tournaments were the primary training mechanism and economic engine of the profession. They were deeply embedded in the social culture of the aristocracy, and the enforcement of any ban required the cooperation of exactly the people who benefited most from the tournaments continuing. The prohibitions were noted, the formal structure for seeking dispensation from them was utilised, and the tournaments continued. The gap between the official position and the actual practice was so consistent and so widely understood that it eventually became part of the normative landscape of the institution. You sought the appropriate indulgence, you acknowledged the technical violation, and you continued. What the code did accomplish, and this is important and tends to get lost in accounts that focus on the violations, was to shape the available language for describing and evaluating behaviour in ways that had real consequences even when the behaviour fell short of the standards the language described. Men who violated the code's requirements still had to explain their violations in the code's own terms. They still had to invoke loyalty, courtesy and honour even when what they were doing fell short of what those terms required, and this meant engaging with the values rather than simply ignoring them. The language was not merely decorative, it structured what could be said and therefore, to some degree, what could be thought, even by people who were in the process of doing something the code would not have endorsed. The tournament circuit again is instructive. The formal ransom system was not imposed from outside on a culture that would have preferred to simply kill and loot. It developed from within the culture because it made the circuit financially stable for everyone who participated, and because the courtesy that went with it made the circuit socially manageable. The code's requirements about prisoner treatment were being followed, in the tournament context, because following them served everyone's interests. This is not the purest form of the ideal, but it is something. Behaviour that conforms to the code's requirements, for reasons that are practical rather than purely principled, is still behaviour that conforms to the code's requirements. The legacy of the chivalric code is visible in ways that extend far beyond the medieval period, and that appear in places that would surprise the code's original framers. The formal conventions of military courtesy, the treatment of prisoners of war, the expectations of non-combatant protection that underlie contemporary international humanitarian law, all of these have roots in the chivalric tradition, transmitted through the centuries of military culture that developed between the medieval period and the present. The transmission was not direct or uncomplicated, and the contemporary versions of these conventions are considerably more comprehensive and more formally enforced than anything the medieval code managed to produce. But the basic structure, the idea that even organised violence should operate within constraints that protect certain categories of people and that govern how combatants treat each other, is recognisably related to what the knights were trying to articulate, however imperfectly and inconsistently they articulated it. The code did not die. It transformed slowly over centuries, shedding some elements and absorbing new ones, migrating from the practical military culture of the high medieval period into the decorative pageantry of the late medieval court, and from there into the literary and cultural tradition that carried versions of it forward long after the actual conditions that produced it had become unrecognisable. What remained was the framework, the vocabulary of honour and courtesy and protection that was never fully realised and never entirely abandoned, the persistent tension between what people aspire to and what they manage to do, which is perhaps the most honest thing that can be said about any moral code that attempts to govern human behaviour in difficult circumstances. History is full of people who meant well and managed inconsistently. The knights are not unusual in this. What makes them worth examining at length is the specificity and detail with which they documented both the ideal and the gap, leaving behind a record of what it looked like when a culture tried to build a moral framework for organised violence and had to live with the results every day. That record, read carefully, is not a story of hypocrisy, or not simply that. It is a story of human beings attempting something genuinely difficult in a world that was not built to make it easier, and producing results that were exactly as mixed as you would expect, which is to say sometimes surprising, sometimes disappointing, frequently complicated and far more interesting than either the hagiography or the dismissal would suggest. The household itself, as a social and economic institution, deserves examination as the primary environment in which the between-time was lived. The lord's household of the high medieval period was not simply a domestic arrangement. It was the basic unit of political, social and economic life for the men attached to it, a portable institution that moved with the lord, organised itself around his needs and priorities, and shaped the daily experience of everyone inside it in ways that were comprehensive rather than partial. You did not work in the household, you lived in it, and the distinction is important. Your social relationships, your economic position, your access to information and patronage and opportunity were all determined by your position within it and by how well you managed that position over time. The hierarchy within a lord's household was formal in some respects and informal in others, and the informal dimensions were frequently more important than the formal ones for the practical business of daily life. Formal hierarchy determined where you sat at table, what share of the lord's gifts you received, what duties were assigned to you. Informal hierarchy determined who listened when you spoke, who came to you with information, who owed you favours and who you owed in return. The informal hierarchy was built through behaviour over time and could not be assigned or delegated, which meant it was the more durable of the two. Men who rose in formal rank without building the informal influence to support it found themselves with titles that other people's behaviour did not confirm, which was an uncomfortable position that the social precision of the household made impossible to ignore. The information economy of the household was as important as the economic economy, and in many ways more interesting, because information in this period was genuinely scarce, in ways that modern readers who live in an environment of continuous information abundance sometimes underestimate. News travelled at the speed of horses and messengers. Political developments in one region reached another region days or weeks after they occurred, often in garbled or partial form. The person who had accurate, timely information about what was happening in the broader political world had a genuine advantage over the person who did not, and the household, with its networks of visitors, messengers, and travellers, was one of the primary mechanisms through which information circulated. Managing your position in this information economy required the same kind of patient, systematic attention that managing your position in the training yard required. You cultivated relationships with people who had access to information you needed. You traded information you had for information you wanted. You were careful about what you shared and with whom, and about the implications of sharing things that were not yours to share. The steward who mentioned the grain supply situation over the morning pottage was not being indiscreet. He was indicating in the specific language of household information exchange that this was something the relevant people should know about, and that knowing it and acting on it appropriately was part of the implicit obligation of your position. You noted it and acted on it appropriately by being prepared for the conversation that would inevitably follow, and by being in a position to contribute something useful to that conversation when it came. The training yard, which has been treated primarily as a site of physical work, was also a social space of specific importance. The relative rankings and relationships within the group of fighting men in a household were partly formal, based on seniority and title and the Lord's explicit assessment, and partly established and maintained through the daily practice of the training yard, where the actual physical capabilities of the various men were visible in ways that nothing else could substitute for. A man who was formally ranked above you but who was visibly less capable in the yard was a man whose formal rank was slightly undercut by that visibility every day, in the specific way that competence undermines credential in any environment where competence can be directly observed. Conversely, a man whose formal rank was lower than his capability would suggest was a man whose capability was working quietly and continuously on his behalf, establishing a credit that would eventually be cashed. You understood your own position in this matrix clearly, because understanding it clearly was necessary to managing it well. You were good enough to be respected by the men above you, and good enough to be a useful training partner for the men below you, which is close to the ideal position. Neither so exceptional that you threatened the men above you, nor so lacking that you provided no value to the men below you. The specific calibration of this position was something you maintained consciously, not through dishonesty but through the choices you made about when to perform fully and when to hold back slightly, when to demonstrate capability and when to demonstrate teachability, when to lead and when to follow. The relationship between the knights of a lord's household and the lord himself was more complex than the formal language of loyalty and service suggested, because it was a relationship of mutual dependency rather than simple subordination. The lord needed capable men, and capable men needed patronage and protection. The exchange was understood by both parties even when it was never stated directly, and the understanding shaped behaviour on both sides. The lord who treated his household knights well had better fighters and more reliable service than the lord who did not, and the household knight who understood the mutual nature of the relationship was better positioned than the one who understood it as simply a hierarchy with himself at the bottom. There were also the obligations to the households in other regions, the extended networks of connection and obligation that a knight's career generated over time. A man who had served in multiple households, or who had travelled extensively on the tournament circuit, had relationships with men in distant places that were not precisely friendships and not precisely professional contacts, but something that partook of both, grounded in shared experience and mutual understanding, and the specific quality of obligation that developed between men who had been in difficult situations together and had handled those situations with appropriate reliability. These relationships were part of the infrastructure of medieval aristocratic life, operating alongside the formal feudal structure and frequently more useful for specific purposes because they were personal and flexible in ways that formal obligation was not. The physical maintenance of the fighter, which might seem like a personal matter rather than a professional one, was in fact managed as a professional responsibility in a well-run household. You were expected to maintain your own capability through training and through the management of injuries and illness in ways that kept you functional. This was not presented primarily as a matter of personal health, but as a matter of professional obligation. A household knight who was not fit to fight was a resource that was not available, which was a failure of the implicit contract the position represented. The fact that the knight's own health was at stake alongside the lord's interests did not change the framing. It was simply the way the professional culture understood the matter. This extended to the management of chronic conditions like the knee, which was approached not as an injury requiring treatment, but as a variable requiring management, with the goal being to maintain adequate function rather than to achieve full recovery. Full recovery might not be possible, and pursuing it aggressively might mean taking time off the training yard that the household could not afford to provide. So the practical approach was to identify the minimum interventions that maintained function at an acceptable level and to incorporate those interventions into the daily routine with as little disruption as possible. If you like the video so far, please leave us a like and a sub. A sub to the channel helps us make more videos for you to watch and keep the channel alive. The ache was acknowledged, the compensation was adjusted, the training continued. This is the mundane reality of professional physical life in this period, stripped of the romance that the formal accounts provide and the drama that the songs prefer. A body maintained with practical attention to function rather than comfort, within a professional culture that treated the body as a resource to be managed rather than an experience to be optimized. It was not inhumane, it was simply organized around different priorities than the modern sensibility prefers, and understanding those priorities clearly is part of understanding why the between time looked the way it did, and why the people living inside it approached it the way they did, and why those approaches produced the results they produced over the long careers of the men who managed them well. So the night ends here, in the quiet that follows a long journey through a world that has been gone for 8 centuries, and that turns out, when you look closely at it, to be populated by people doing things that are recognizable in ways that the formal history does not always make clear. Think about the threads that ran through tonight. A knight waking up before sunrise in a cold stone chamber, dealing with a letter he has not answered and a knee he's not mentioning, and the specific texture of an ordinary day in a life that was built around anything but the ordinary. William Marshal, handed over as a hostage before he was 5 years old, spending 7 decades in the careful and patient construction of something from materials that were never quite adequate and that he made sufficient anyway. A tournament fighter standing in a field at dawn with a team of 4 instead of 6, doing the math of his profession with the clear-eyed precision of someone who has learned that the math is inseparable from the fighting. And the code that framed all of this, the language of honour and loyalty and protection that everyone used and that shaped the world even when the people using it fell short of what it required. What connects them is not heroism, though heroism is present in individual moments when circumstances required it. What connects them is something quieter and more durable, the long middle of things, the sustained effort that is not dramatic and does not make it into the songs, and that is nonetheless where most of life is actually lived. The between time, the administrative morning and the training yard and the standing outside doors and the dying fire and the cold pottage and the unanswered letter and the team that is 5 instead of 6 and the code that is aspired to and not quite reached and aspired to again regardless. Medieval knighthood is one of the most thoroughly mythologized subjects in the popular imagination, which means it is also one of the most thoroughly obscured. The myth goes in 2 directions simultaneously: the gleaming ideal of the perfect knight, brave and courteous and loyal and protective, fighting for the right causes with the right weapons and the right heart, and the cynical counter-image, the brutal oppressor, the instrument of class violence, the armoured thug with a poetry problem. Both of these are present in the historical record, in specific people and specific moments. Neither of them is the whole thing, or even most of it. Most of it was the cold morning and the training yard and the standing outside doors. Most of it was the careful accumulation of small competencies, the management of competing obligations, the navigation of social hierarchies that were simultaneously formal and flexible, the maintenance of equipment and relationships and reputations that were all, in their different ways, instruments of professional survival. Most of it was ordinary, in the specific way that any professional life is ordinary. Long stretches of routine work punctuated by occasional moments of the kind of intensity that makes the routine feel worth enduring. And in that ordinary middle, these were people, genuine, complicated, morally inconsistent, physically limited, emotionally present people, doing what people in every era do, which is finding ways to continue in circumstances that were not designed for their comfort, adapting to systems that were larger than them, occasionally surprising themselves with what they could manage, and living most of their lives in the space between the ideal they aspired to and the reality they inhabited. That space is not a failure. It is the human condition. It is what it looks like when people who take something seriously try to live up to it in a world that offers only partial support for their ambitions. The gap between the chivalric ideal and the chivalric practice is not primarily a story of hypocrisy. It is primarily a story of the genuine difficulty of being what you believe you should be, in circumstances that make being it complicated, which is a story that has not gone out of fashion. The fire is low now. The night outside is quiet in the way that nights become quiet after midnight, when the last sounds have settled and the darkness has found its comfortable register. This is the part of the night that belongs to rest, the part where the thinking that has been happening can be allowed to settle without needing to resolve, because not everything resolves, and the parts that do not resolve can be carried gently rather than pursued. Let the cold chamber and the training yard settle where they belong. Let William Marshal's effigy in the temple church lie in its centuries of stone composure. Let the tournament field return to the agricultural ground it was before the flags went up, and will be again when the horses have gone. Let the code rest in its imperfect, aspiring, genuinely trying condition, which is exactly the condition in which all codes that take human nature seriously will always find themselves. You have been a long time in history tonight, and history is tiring in the specific way of things that are real and complicated, and that refuse to simplify into something you can hold lightly. Set it down. The night has done its work. Sleep. Where in the world are you watching from? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this. See you on the next one.